I never had anybody complain that my sermon was too short. Okay? Just doesn't happen. As I said before, my name is Ken Tobler. I'm a retired minister. I'm filling in for my friend Bill Tankersley today. It's good to be with you. He told me to do whatever I wanted to do, and I'm going to do what I want to do. And what I want to do today, well, you may wonder about the bruise on my chin. Now, you hadn't noticed it? Well, maybe I'm wasting my time. I was going to give you two stories, and you can take whichever one you prefer, okay? One story is I had dental surgery. But the second story is my wife faked a right cross, and I ducked, and then she nailed me with a left hook. Now, whichever one you prefer, you can believe and tell to others. It doesn't make me any difference. So I'm easy either way. What I want to talk to you today is about faith stories. From earliest times, faith was communicated and passed from generation to generation, not by doctrines that people memorized or by creeds that people stood up and recited. Our faith was handed down through stories. And stories can be a very powerful way of communicating truth and of communicating faith. Our ancestors loved to tell stories about their heroes, Moses, Abraham, King David. And within the stories that they told, people learned who they were, whose they were, and what God expected them to be about. Now, stories have always been powerful in communication. A good story can make us smile. It might make us laugh. It could make us sad. Could make us cry. It could make us go, ooh, or it could make us go, Stories can be powerful ways of communication because they don't give us the answer. It leaves it up to us to come up with what does this story mean and how can we apply it to our lives. Let me tell you about a man who was very successful. He was a very hard-working businessman. He not only worked hard and put in long hours, but he also worked smart. And because he was so diligent in his hard work and his smart work, he made tons of money. He made so much money he was able to give his wife the very best of everything. His wife lived in a beautiful home. She drove luxury cars. She dressed herself in expensive clothes and jewelry. She had everything that money could buy. But she was very unhappy because, well, frankly, she was lonely. Her husband was never home. He would get up early in the morning and be gone to work. And often she was in bed at night when she would hear him come in. He never took weekends off. He worked. They never took vacations. So although she had everything, she was very lonely because he was never with her. One day, while her husband was working, he had a heart attack and he died. And she regretted her husband's death because she truly loved him and she mourned his death. But in the years to come, she found another man and fell in love with and married. But this time she was careful to choose a man who loved her more than his work. And they lived happily ever after, spending the money that her first husband had made. Stories can be powerful. And stories leave it up to us to say, what's the purpose of this story? What does it mean? How are we supposed to react? Are we supposed to go, ooh, or smile? Or what are we supposed to do with this story? Jesus was a master storyteller. That was part of his rabbinic tradition, was learning to tell stories. And Jesus knew how to tell a story because Jesus understood something about us, about people. And that is, when we start hearing a story, we start trying to figure out how it's going to end. Do you realize that? When we start hearing a story, we start trying to figure out where the story's going and how it's going to end. Not many people are good storytellers because their stories are predictable. A movie is a story. In most movies, when I buy the ticket, I know how it's going to end, okay? In other words, it's very predictable. If I'm going to a Mission Impossible movie with Tom Cruise, when I buy my ticket, I know he's going to do whatever it was that they said was impossible to do. If I go to a romantic movie, I know that the man and the woman are somehow going to wind up together at the end of the movie, regardless of the obstacles that the story brings up along the way. In other words, when I buy the ticket, I know how the story is going to end. But every now and then, there's a movie that's the script is written by somebody who knows how to tell a story. And you know what everybody tells you? Oh, it has a surprise ending. It has a surprise ending. In other words, when you buy your ticket, you're not going to know how it's going to end. And during the movie, you're not going to be able to figure out from the first scene where it's all going to go. In other words, it's written by somebody that knows how to tell a good story. Jesus knew when we start hearing stories, we're going to start trying to figure out where they're going. And so Jesus did something very effective in his stories. He put in surprises. He put in twists in the stories. Sometimes his stories were shocking to the people when they heard them. And there were times they were downright offensive. That when the people heard the story, the original audience that heard his story, they were offended by it. They didn't like it at all. Now, today, we've grown up in the church with the stories of Jesus. We call them parables. A good definition of a parable is that it's an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. Jesus taught by stories, and his stories are revered by the church today, but we've heard them so often that we forget that the original audience who heard them were surprised, sometimes they were shocked, sometimes they were offended by them. And so it's hard for us to do this, but let's try to go back in time and listen with the first audience who heard the story. Remembering that when Jesus starts the story, they're trying to figure out where it's going to go. They're trying to anticipate. And Jesus is going to throw in things that are shocking, surprising, sometimes offensive in telling of the stories. And that's what made them so memorable. Even the people that didn't like the stories could remember what they were. In other words, they were unforgettable. And so Jesus was a master storyteller. And let's try to listen to the stories again, these parables, as the original audience that heard them. First of all, let's just take a very common, one of the favorite parables, the parable of the prodigal son. We all know that story. I'm not even going to read it. Now, we need to ask ourselves, as Jesus told the story, what was surprising or shocking or maybe offensive during the story? As he told the story of the prodigal son, the first thing that was absolutely shocking to the audience was that a son would go up to his very much alive father and ask for his share of the inheritance now. That would be shocking today. Now, we've got some men here. I have a son. Y'all may have sons too. Imagine how you would feel if when your son was 18 or 19 years old, he'd come up to you and said, Dad, you know, I've been thinking, you're going to croak one of these days. Now, I know we don't want to talk about it. It may be 10 or 15 years away. We hope it is. But one of these days, you're going to kick the bucket. And I was thinking that when that happens, you're probably going to remember me, and I'll be remembered in your estate. And what I wanted to know, Dad, is would you just mind just going ahead and giving me that money now? I've got my eye on a sports car that would really sit well with me. And I know I would be a chick magnet if I were driving that car. And I also would like to travel some overseas. I don't want to wait till I'm 35 or 40 and too old to enjoy it. So how about it, Dad? Would you just give me my money now? If your son had said that to you, you would be shocked and you would be offended. You'd be offended that he thought you were so stupid that you might do it, right? And if you gave him anything, it might be the back of your hand for having such audacity to come up and make such a request. So the audience was shocked at what the way the son talked to the father. And if it's shocking to us today, imagine what it was like in that day. Because in that day, the father literally had life and death control over his children. He was the master of the household. He ruled the roost. And the people, when they heard the story, they couldn't believe that a son would speak so disrespectfully to his father. So that was shocking, that a son would come up with such a request in a day when the children were the property of their parents. But then Jesus followed by an even bigger shock. The second shock was bigger than the first one. The father granted the son's request. Now, when Jesus said this, their jaws would have hit the ground. He did what? The father did what? They couldn't believe their ears. Why? Now remember, when you start hearing a story, the son's wanting all this money. Why would it be idiotic for the father to give it to him? Because he was going to waste it. It'd soon be gone. Everybody that heard the story knew that would happen if the son were given the money. He would spend it on sports cars and travel and who knows what. They knew that that son and the money would soon be parted. So when Jesus said, when this son came up to his father with such an offensive request and in such an offensive manner, and the father granted it, they thought the son was rude beyond measure and the father deserved a straitjacket. They thought the father is nuts. Why is he doing this? I mean, why in the world? What sane father would give his son the inheritance when he's so much alive and he knows the son is too immature to handle it? So they thought the father was as nutty as a fruitcake. He did what? He gave his son the money. And under Jewish law, if you had two sons, the elder son got 2/3, the younger son got 1/3, okay? So in effect, the father liquidated 1/3 of his estate. That means he probably had to sell some land and some possessions and all to give the son his 1/3. And so the people, the really shocking thing after the first shocking thing was that the father said, okay, I'll do it. Everyone who heard the story knew the kid wasn't mature enough to handle his inheritance, that it would soon be gone. And as they thought ahead, well, where is this story headed? They knew it was where it was headed. They knew that that son was going to spend all of his money and he was going to come crawling back to dad after it was all gone. In other words, they're thinking ahead and they see where this story's headed. The waste of his inheritance confirmed, as Jesus told the story, what the people predicted all along. And when he came crawling back home, they predicted that too. The story doesn't explicitly say it, but we should remember the way it's told. The father saw his son coming from a distance, far off. The father knew he was going to waste his money and that he'd be coming back home. Have you ever thought of that? That's why the father was looking down that road. He watched his son go away, and as he worked in the coming days, weeks, perhaps months, he was looking down that road knowing his son was going to be coming home again, broke and penniless, and he'd be coming back to his father. And so the father was watching. He was looking. He was waiting. And then suddenly, in the distance, he saw something. Could that be him? I think it might be. And as he walked closer from a distance, the father said, it's him, it's him. And he ran to meet him. Now, in those days, men wore long robes. And the only way you could run in a long robe was to pick up the front and expose your bare legs. So the father lifted up his robe and ran to meet his son, which is rather comical. In other words, for the community and others who saw the father running, it would have been a funny sight watching the father run to meet his son. And then Jesus, though, once again surprised his audience. You see, they're thinking what's going to happen. They're trying to figure this story out. And they're assuming the father is going to react to the son like they would have reacted to the son if their son had done it. And they could just imagine the father really laying down the law saying, well, look who's here, Mr. Smarty Pants, Mr. Know-It-All. Where's all the money you got, son? What'd you do with it? Don't tell me it's gone. I tried to tell you, but no, you wouldn't listen. In other words, blah, 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 blah. The audience anticipated the father finally coming to his senses and really laying down the law to his son. But Jesus surprised him. The father instead ran, picked up the front of his robe and ran, and then embraced his son. His son had memorized his speech that he was going to give his father. Oh, I've sinned before God, before you. I've disgraced my family. I've done all these shameful things. I'm so sorry. But the father didn't want to listen. He had his servants bring robes and the ring and shoes and give him some clean clothes. And then the father did the unthinkable. He killed the fatted calf and he invited all the community to come and help him celebrate his son's safe return. Now, to the audience that heard this was too over the top. This was rewarding, excessively rewarding, immature behavior. Irresponsibility was being honored by this party. And so they were offended that the father would receive the son back this way. You know what they thought the son should have to do? He ought to have to earn his way back into the family. He ought to have to be out there an hour before sunrise and an hour after sunset working in the field. And after he did that for maybe 6 months or a year, the father could then say, all right, we're going to take you back in the family. I hope you've learned your lesson. You see, we live in a world where we think people must earn what they get. That somehow it's up to us to do something to merit. Remember, in the parable, the Father's God. And God, as revealed by Jesus, is a God who doesn't make us earn his love. It's freely given. That's what we call grace. Grace is free love. Love without having to earn it. Pardon without even deserving it. And so, in the story, the Father in the parable acts like God. He's not anxious to punish. He just wants to welcome the sinner back home, like the Father, like God does us. So the Father, according to the listeners, though, who were listening to it, they thought he was rewarding immaturity and stupidity. And then Jesus works in one more twist in the story. One more twist. There's the elder brother. Some people say he's probably the reason the younger son wanted out of the house in the first place. If any of you have elder brothers, I was a younger brother, of course, and I was a delight to the household, but my other brother was something else. Anyway, he brings in the elder brother who's out in the field, and he starts hearing music and festivities and people laughing and having a good time. And the elder brother also knew how the story was going to go. He knew that younger brother, when he left, he was going to spend his money. It'd soon be gone. He assumes that he spent it on prostitutes and loose living. And some people say the story didn't tell us how he lost his money, but it tells us the older brother told us how he would have spent the money had he been given it, He knew how he would have wasted it. And so in the story, the elder brother hears all this, and then he goes home and he stays out on the porch. He's not going to go in. He's out there pouting, waiting for his father to see him and come out and say, well, what's wrong? Why aren't you here? And finally, the father, maybe somebody tells him, your oldest son is out there, and he's standing out on the porch. Why isn't he in the party? And the father goes out and says, well, son, come in. Your younger brother's here. Come in and join the party with us. Welcome his safe return. He's still alive. It was like he was dead. Now he's alive. Come in and join the party. And then the elder brother lights into his father. Listen, I've worked my finger to the bone all these years for you. I've gone out in that field every day, and I've worked in that hot sun, and I've done a good job. I've helped maintain this farm, this operation here. It wouldn't be what it is without me. I've always been there for you. And you know what? You've never had a party for me. You've never invited my friends in the community over to celebrate me and what I've done. And he's really angry at his father. And now, remember, we're trying to think of the story in terms of the original audience, people who don't know where the story's going. They were agreeing with the older brother. They were taking his side. He's right. The father, he's taken this older son for granted all these years. And so they're siding with the older brother. And the father said, why are you so angry? Everything that I have is yours. Now, let's go back again to understand what he's saying. The elder son gets 2/3. The younger son gets 1/3. He's liquidated 1/3 of his estate, given it to the younger son. So everything, 100% now of what the father has left will become the property of the older son. In other words, what I've done hasn't cost you one penny. I haven't shortchanged you at all, because everything that I have is yours. See, when the father ultimately dies, it's not going to be divided again, 2/3 and 1/3. It's already been divided. So the father's saying, you're not out a penny. Why are you so angry? But your younger brother, it was like he was dead. And now he's alive again. We didn't know whether he was alive or not. And now he's back home. He's alive. Let's welcome him back home. Can't you celebrate his love? And so the story ends, and it doesn't have an ending. Did you ever realize that? This story really doesn't have an ending. When the story concludes, we're left on the front porch with the older brother, having to decide whether we're going to be forgiving and loving, or we're going to sit out there and pout and say, this isn't right. So we've got to make a decision. Are we going to be like that older brother, or are we going to come in and join the party? Jesus leaves the story open, and we've got to decide what we're going to do. A masterful story. You know why the Father gave the party? In the ancient world, eating with people was a sign of reconciliation and forgiveness. In the Bible, there's many stories where enemies, once they've been reconciled, and as a sign of their reconciliation, they have a dinner. They have a feast. And they all get together. And so in the eating together, they're showing that all is forgiven. And we're now reconciled. The Father gave the dinner because he wanted the community. See, that little community where they lived, everybody knew everybody else's business. They knew what the Father had done. They knew what the younger son had done. And by giving the dinner and letting the community come in and see him eating with his son, he wanted the community to know that he had forgiven his son. He wanted that well understood. The Father and his Son were now reconciled. He wanted everybody to know it. But in giving the feast and inviting the people to come and to join in it, he's saying to the community, I want you to also forgive my son. Let's welcome him home. We'll hope and pray he's learned a lesson, that he'll be a different person in the future. But I want you to come, and like me, I want you to forgive my son. It's a masterful story. It doesn't have a true ending as such. Jesus knew how to tell a story. And he knew how to shock his audience and put twists and turns in the story so that the people couldn't figure out what all was going to happen. And sometimes when they found out what happened, sometimes they were surprised, or maybe sometimes they were shocked, and maybe sometimes they were offended. But when we look at that story, we know that the Father represents God, and it teaches us that God, when he bestows his blessings upon us, knows we're probably going to waste them. Do you ever think of that? Most of God's love and forgiveness is wasted. We take it for granted. Much like that younger son did in his foolishness, we receive God's love, his blessings, his goodness, and most of it's just wasted on us because we go our own way, we do our foolish things. And the story teaches us that God knows this when he blesses us, that most of his blessings are going to go underappreciated and unused. The story also teaches us another important thing about God. God allows his children to make mistakes. God doesn't save us from ourselves. He hopes we'll learn from them, but God allows us to make mistakes. Have you ever prayed a prayer to God and say, God, please stop me, or don't let me do this, or don't let me do that? God gives us free wills. And sometimes that means we're going to go the wrong way. We're going to get off course. We're going to do things that we should be ashamed of. But God gives us the freedom. He hopes we won't squander them, but often we do. The third thing it teaches us is if we do squander the blessings that God has given us and we repent, God's more than anxious to receive us back. He rejoices. He's not anxious to lecture us and say, I told you so, or why would you listen to me? I tried to tell you. And instead, God just rejoices. And the Bible teaches angels in heaven rejoice when a sinner repents. And so ultimately, I think the story teaches us that it's more important to be loving and forgiving than it is to be fair and just. The story is not about justice. It's about mercy. It's not about what's fair. It's about what's loving and kind and forgiving. A wonderful story. Another story, perhaps the other of the two most famous parables, and we need to understand how it was a surprise to those who heard it, was a parable of the Good Samaritan. Now, when Jesus was asked a question, and who is my neighbor? He told a story. Again, he was a master storyteller, and in the Hebraic traditions, they taught by stories. And so Jesus is trying to teach an answer to the question, who is my neighbor? And to understand the story, we need to again listen as the first people listened, how they heard the story and where the story was leading and where it was going and their anticipation of how the story is going to go and where Jesus worked in surprises. Sometimes he shocked people in these stories. Sometimes he offended them. So let's take a look at this parable and ask ourselves, what did Jesus do that was surprising, shocking, or offensive in this very popular parable of the Good Samaritan? The first thing that would have really surprised people was that a man went from Jerusalem to Jericho alone. I mean, that was unthinkable. Don't know any of you very well, but I'll bet you anything there's places in Tulsa you wouldn't walk and go through at night alone or during the day alone. I bet you'd avoid certain places. Why? Because you've got good sense. It's dangerous. You don't want to do that. Well, have any of you ever been from Jerusalem to Jericho? Have anybody here ever made the journey? You have? Okay, you have too. What's it like? It's nothing. It is desolate. Its main value is it helps hold the world together. It is part of what's known as the Judean wilderness. It's little hills, and there's no real vegetation, although in the February or so, in their so-called winter months or cooler months, you see just a tinge of what might be a little green on the north sides of the hills. And it's a very barren, desolate place. And during the time of the New Testament, it's where thieves and robbers would hide out. They couldn't hide out in town. So to hide out from the Romans and from the authorities, they would go out and they would hide out in the wilderness. That's where they lived. And people that went through there were subject to their thievery and so forth, robbing, killing, looting. They did what they could. So to travel through that very dangerous, and incidentally it's a big descent. Jericho is real close to the Dead Sea. So basically, you're talking about the lowest point on earth. Jerusalem's kind of for that country, it's in a hilly area. So you're going from a high altitude to a low altitude, and you do it really quickly. So the road along is steep and winding as you go through from hill to through between the hills, and as you work your way down. But it was the main thing is it was dangerous. And when the people heard that a man went from Jerusalem to Jericho alone, they thought, this guy's nuts. You don't do that. In our own country, we grew up with Westerns. You don't see many Westerns anymore, do you? But when wagon trains were traveling west, the reason people didn't start off alone is that it was too dangerous. There could be illness, there could be accidents, there could be injury, there could be Indians. Now, I say Indians today because that's what they always said in the movies. Nobody ever looked out from a wagon train and said, the Native Americans are coming, the Native Americans are coming. You know, they didn't do that. So they used nobody knew the correct terminology back when they did the Westerns. They say the Indians are coming, you know. And so people knew it was very dangerous to travel west. And in the west, there were also the thieves and the robbers. Incidentally, this didn't have anything to do with my lesson. I just thought of a funny story. I read it, and I don't know whether it's true or not. You read stories sometimes, and you wonder, did this really happen? But it said a Methodist preacher was traveling in the West on a stagecoach, and robbers held up the stagecoach. And all the men had to get out, and they were supposed to hand over their wallets. And when the Methodist minister handed his wallet to one of the robbers, he said, you wouldn't steal from a poor Methodist preacher, would you? And the robber handed it back and said, well, heck no, I'm a Methodist myself. Anyway, that's a funny story. But in the West, people traveled in wagon trains because of safety. There's safety in numbers. And we might walk through some of those dangerous areas of Tulsa in our community. If there were police with us and we were within a large group of people, we might think, hey, we're safe. We feel safe in numbers. So when the audience heard this about this man traveling from Jericho to Jerusalem, and he's traveling alone, and they're trying to figure out where this story is going to go, what do you think they think is going to happen to this guy? He's traveling through a dangerous area without the safety of numbers. Something bad is going to happen to this guy. They thought he was very foolish. And so when Jesus had this man robbed and beaten to near death, do you know there's people that probably thought he's getting what he deserved? They could see this was coming. This was a foolish thing the man did. And when Jesus told what happened to him, some of the people probably nodded and said, well, he deserved that. Often in life, we blame victims, don't we? We do. Remember a number of years ago when that high school senior was on the trip, Natalie Holloway in Aruba, and she went out with 3 guys on the last night, and they were going from drinking and going from bar to bar, and she wound up missing, never have found her. She was obviously killed, and I've heard people at the time say, well, she deserved it. She should have, that was a dumb thing to do. But let me remind you of something. The penalty for doing something dumb isn't death. And if for a teenager to do something dumb, if they deserved death, none of us would have survived our 13th birthday, would we? I mean, we did dumb things all the time. And so here was this man traveling from Jericho to Jerusalem alone in a very dangerous area, and the thing happened to him that everybody thought would happen to him. And a lot of the people thought when he was beaten and robbed and left for dead that he got what he deserved. But the story wasn't over. They'd figured out this part of the story. The story continued. Jesus then had 2 people come by. First a priest, and then later it says a Levite. Now you need to understand this about the story. Levites were a tribe of priests. If you were a man in the tribe of Levite, you were a priest. So actually the story is having 2 different priests come by. The Levite was a priest, the other was a priest. And if we tried to translate into that to our modern day, if Jesus were telling the story, it would be like 2 clergy went by separately. They came by and they saw the man. They thought, oh, this is dangerous. I'm getting out of here. Now, it doesn't deal with the fact that these 2 came along and they were also traveling alone. That's not a part of the story. We shouldn't try to read everything into a story and overanalyze them. The stories are parables of Jesus are told for their immediate impact. But anyway, 2 people who were considered religious leaders of the people highly esteemed and looked up to. They came by, and there was one of their fellow countrymen dying. And they walked by on the other side. They didn't stop to help him. Now, these 2 people, because they were their religious leaders, they would have been heroes to the people. And it's like 2 good guys came along, and they didn't do a thing to help their fellow countryman who'd made a dumb decision, but who'd found himself near death. And then, so the people would have been surprised at who Jesus chose to be the villains of the story, because they saw them as students of Scripture, very disciplined in their worship of God. And if Jesus were telling the story today, he would be telling us about our religious leaders. And then the third thing that's very shocking in the story is this, that a Samaritan would help a Jew. Okay? That would have shocked the people. The people who first heard it thought, you got to be kidding. The Samaritan would stop to help a Jew. There was bad blood between the Samaritans and the Jews. A lot of enmity. We need to understand the reason behind this. Israel originally, as one country, was a small, dinky little country, okay? And Israel today is about 1/8 the size of the state of Oklahoma. We're talking about a small, small area of the world. But the kingdom of Israel was divided into Israel and Judah after the death of a king. The 2 sons each took half the kingdom. Then the northern kingdom fell in 721 BC. The northern kingdom fell. The southern kingdom didn't. And the southern kingdom contained Jerusalem. The northern kingdom that fell, over a period of over 100 years, they intermarried with their conquerors. So that the people in the southern kingdom, when they looked to the north of the area that they then called Samaria, the Samaritans were kind of like, to use an unflattering term, half-breeds. They were kind of their illegitimate ancestors, or there's a trace of them, but they had intermarried with the Gentiles, with all these evil people, and what they practiced wasn't true religion anymore. There was a deep hatred for them. More than the Jews disliked Gentiles, they disliked Samaritans. They were their arch enemies. So it would have been offensive in this parable for the heroes of the parable, the villains of the parable, to be the heroes of the people, and the hero of the parable to be the villain of the people. That would have been offensive to them, to compare their priest and their religious leaders unfavorably to a Samaritan. The people who heard this story did not like it at all, because Jesus gave a slap in the face to the official religion of that time and what the people were being taught. If Jesus were telling the story to us today, who do you think he would choose? He wouldn't say Good Samaritan. That wouldn't mean anything to us. It meant a lot to the people then. They thought there was no such thing as a Good Samaritan. That was an oxymoron. The only Good Samaritan was a dead one. But Jesus told the story, and he surprised them and shocked them and offended them by making the hero of the story their archenemy. Today, who would it be? Would it be a Muslim helping a Christian? I don't know how Jesus would tell the story today. Would it be a communist? Who would he choose to be that person that we look down upon? In the South, it might be a black man stopping to help a white man. It would depend upon the people. Jesus wouldn't tell the same story to different audiences. I mean, he would tell it different ways to different people. But the main thing is, the ones that were considered the religious heroes were the villains. Those who were considered villains became the hero. Jesus told this story remember he told the story because he was asked, who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? And ultimately it says the person, regardless of what I think of him, the person who's there for me and helps me. That person is the one who's being neighborly, the one who puts himself out to be on my side. Stories are very powerful. Sometimes I worry that people today are forgetting the stories of the Bible that ground us in who we are and whose we are and what we are to be about. Because if we don't know the stories, we don't know the lessons that the stories are trying to teach us. And when a faith story is told, we shouldn't ask questions of science or history. Now, did this really happen? Did it this way? What was that father in the parable of the father's son? What was his name? What was the name of his son? What was the name of his older son? Where did this happen? What was the town? How much money did the father have? These are questions that are irrelevant to the story. When you hear a faith story, ask faith questions. What is this story designed to teach? When I hear this story, how am I supposed to react? What am I supposed to believe? What am I supposed to do? How is it supposed to change my life? What am I supposed to learn from this story? Ask the questions of faith. So that if it's a story about David and Goliath, you don't wonder, well, now, was he really 9 feet tall? Or maybe was he just 8 feet 7? It doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. The important thing in a faith story is to ask faith questions so that we get faith answers. That's why the stories are told. It's been a pleasure to be with you today. I know they're going to be coming in and setting up. I'm going to let you out a little early, as I told you I would. I never... you what? Tell us one more story. All right, just a story. There was a young woman who was very, very beautiful. Everybody who knew her complimented her on her appearance. She had a beautiful face, beautiful hair, sparkling eyes, had a great personality, and a beautiful figure. And when people saw her, everybody complimented on her. Oh, you are so pretty. They told her, you should be a model. You do great in modeling. Or you should be an actress on television. People would pay to see you. And because everybody complimented her on her appearance, she became more and more conscious of how she looked. She wanted to make sure that every time she went out in public, her hair was flawless. Her makeup was just right. Her clothing and accessories were all blended together. And this became her identity, was trying to maintain this image. She only had one problem, just one. Like the rest of us, perhaps, she had a tendency to put on a little weight. And so she was constantly dieting. She became obsessed with keeping her figure down. And she was constantly struggling to maintain that beautiful figure. And in the process of trying to keep her weight down, she developed an eating disorder, and she died. And at her funeral, when people walked by her casket, everybody said, "Doesn't she look nice?" That's a story, okay? Let's conclude with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you, O God, for the stories of the Bible, and we thank you especially for the stories of Jesus. We remember singing as children, "Tell me the stories of Jesus," that we long to hear. Help us, O God, to develop a new appreciation for the stories that teach us our faith and ground us in our faith, that we may learn from them and become better disciples of our Lord Jesus Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen. Good to be with you. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you.